Hi, boys and girls. So, this story that we're reading today is really tricky and it's a really long story with a big timeline. So, I wanted to make a video to read it to you. That way, in case you had any questions or you weren't sure what a word was when you were trying to work on it after small group, you would be able to watch this and be able to pause it and help you understand the story. So, this is called Sacagawea's Journey into History by Jeanette Cannon. Remember, this week we are focusing on sequence words. So we're focusing on the order of events, what happens first and next and then and last. And as I'm reading to you, I'm going to be highlighting some of those sequence words that are going to be important for answering our questions. So I'm going to start at paragraph 1. You may have seen this gold-colored dollar coin. It shows the face of a young Native American woman carrying a baby on her back. She is one of the only women on a U.S. legal coin. So who was she? Sacagawea was a Shoshone Indian born at the end of the 1700s in an area now called Idaho. So that's next to our state. When it says at the end of the 1700s, that tells us sequence. It tells us that that's where our story begins. Her early life was difficult. Sometime between 1799 and 1801, she was captured by a group of Hidatsa Indians and taken away from her people. She was only 12 years old. By age 16, she was married to a French fur trader named Toussaint Charbonneau, who lived with the Hidatsas. Her adventures were just beginning. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson decided to map out the newly expanded nation. He sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark on an expedition to explore the land. Remember, we read this it was last Wednesday, where we read about Lewis and Clark and how we followed their sequence of events through their journey west. And they are our main characters in this part of history also. In May of 1804, the explorers began traveling on the Missouri River in canoes. One of their jobs was to take notes about what they saw. They drew pictures of plants and animals they saw. They made maps as they went along. They carried with them special tools to help them as they traveled. Everything was wrapped so water could not damage anything. In November 1804, Lewis met Charbonneau and hired him as a translator. Sacagawea joined her husband on the expedition. Their baby was born soon after the journey began. Though Sacagawea was not a guide on the journey, she helped the travelers in many ways. One of Lewis and Clark's diary entries from May 14th, 1805, tells how Sacagawea's calm bravery saved important objects and information from being lost forever. And now I'm going to continue reading on page 2. And I'm going to zoom in. One day, a terrible storm caused Sacagawea's canoe to tip over. All of the men were trying to get the canoe upright. Sacagawea calmly went into the water. Her baby was strapped to her back. She saved the notebooks and tools that would have floated away. Later that year, the explorers came to the Shoshone territory. Sacagawea helped them find a route through the mountains. She also helped them buy horses from her fellow Shoshone. A few months later, the group had their first look at the Pacific Ocean. Before beginning the return journey, so there's another sequence. So before they began to return home, the explorers built a camp to stay in over the winter. In May of 1806, a few months after they started their journey home, the travelers met a group of Nez Perce Indians. Sacagawea helped the two groups speak to each other. On the way back east, Sacagawea guided the group along trails she remembered from her childhood. There's another sequence on the way back east, so as they're traveling back home. One important trail was a gap in the mountains that led them to the Yellowstone River. The journey ended for Sacagawea in August of 1806. People who traveled with her wrote about her cheerfulness and helpfulness. They all said that she showed great courage. In 2000, 2 centuries after Sacagawea was born, a special US dollar coin was created. It honors a brave young woman who helped explore a new nation. It says the Postal Service issued this stamp in honor of Sacagawea in 1994. And up here you can see this picture. It's Lewis and Clark's winter camp at Fort Clatsop. It's now a National Historic Park near Astoria, Oregon. So if you've gone to Seaside, I know we've talked about this in morning meeting a couple of times. Astoria is just north of Seaside, and you could go and actually see their camp. It's still there. It's really, really cool. So on page 3, there is a timeline, and this timeline gives us dates in order, in the order that these events in the story happened. So in 1788, Sacagawea was born. Between 1799 and 1801, she was captured by the Hidatsas. And then it shows us here, Lewis and Clark's expedition begins right here in 1804. It shows us in November 1804 that that Charbonneau and Sacagawea joined the expedition. May 1805 is when Sacagawea saved the important information from the canoe tipping over in the storm. In August 1805, Sacagawea helped Lewis and Clark trade for Shoshone horses. November 1805, they reach the Pacific Ocean. December 1805, they build Fort Clatsop and they stay there for the winter until May 1806. The group meets up with several Nez Perce chiefs, and Charbonneau and Sacagawea help translate. In July of 1806, Sacagawea and the group reach the Yellowstone River. And then it shows us our last event is March 1811. Sacagawea and Charbonneau moved to South Dakota, and that's where they stayed. So now we have some questions to answer. Question 1, look again at the timeline. So that's the page we just did. That's page 3. Based on the sequence shown there, which 2 statements are true? Based on this timeline. So we have to look for events that are on that timeline. So 1, Lewis and Clark spoke with the Nez Perce chiefs at Fort Clatsop. When they were at Fort Clatsop, they didn't speak with any of the other Native Americans. It was just them camping for the winter. So that we know that is not A. B, Sacagawea met Charbonneau during the expedition. Remember that they met before the expedition, and that's how they started on the journey together, because Charbonneau was asked to be a translator and Sacagawea decided to join him. Lewis and Clark reached the Yellowstone River near the end of their journey. Well, let's look. When I look over here and it talks about the Yellowstone River, this chunk right here where it changes color, this is their journey. And it is at the end of their journey, so that one is correct. They did reach the Yellowstone River towards the end of their journey. Sacagawea helped prepare for the journey by buying horses. So at the beginning of this journey, it doesn't say anything about buying horses. That's later in the journey when they've already started. So we know that it's not D. The group faced a dangerous storm early in their journey when they're talking about the canoes tipping over. So when it talks about during a storm, this is May of 1805. So yeah, that's towards the beginning of their journey, because the halfway point would be about here. And it's at the very beginning of it. So that one would be correct. And Sacagawea was captured by the Hidatsa Indians after moving to South Dakota. Well, she was captured in the very beginning of her life, and she moved to South Dakota at the end. So we know that that one's not true. Those are 2 completely different events. And it says what 2 statements, and we have C and E. So we do have 2 statements. Question 2. This question is 2 parts. First answer part A, then part B. What happened first after Sacagawea helped the explorers buy horses from the Shoshone? So I'm going to go back and look. It says that Sacagawea helped buy horses from her fellow Shoshone. It tells us that in paragraph 8. It's asking what happened right after. Well, paragraph 9, it says a few months later, the group had their first look at the Pacific Ocean. Before beginning their return journey, the explorers built a camp to stay in over winter. So let's look at our choices. The group stayed at Fort Clatsop for the winter. The group met with the Nez Perce Indians. Sacagawea married Toussaint Charbonneau. Sacagawea remembered a gap in the mountains. Well, these two things did not happen in that paragraph. Sacagawea did not meet the Nez Perce Indians there, and she married Charbonneau before this whole journey. So that leaves us with A and D. And we found this in paragraph 9. So when it says, where did you find specific information for that answer? In paragraph 9. But you need to choose. A lot of you guys, I've noticed, have been marking 2 of them, the 2 that I leave you with. Now this one, it does say 2, but this one, it's asking what event. That's one event. You need to choose A or D. You cannot choose both, otherwise it's wrong. Okay, now on page 5, this part is really complicated. So these sequence events, you're going to have to look back at all of these things we highlighted. Do you see how I highlighted one day later that year, May 1806? You are going to have to look at those and figure out when these events happened. Question 4, what is important sequence information does paragraph 5 include? So I go back and look at paragraph 5. It says, in November of 1804, Lewis met Charbonneau and hired him as a translator. Sacagawea joined her husband on the expedition. Their baby was born soon after the journey began. So now I look at my choices. It explains why the expedition was necessary. It describes Sacagawea's husband as a brave man. It tells when Sacagawea joined the expedition. It shows that the baby was born in winter. So thinking about those things and thinking about paragraph 5, choose the best answer. Read this sentence from paragraph 8. Sacagawea helped them find a route through the mountains. What is the meaning of route in this context? Is it a wide tunnel to travel through? Train tracks in the mountains? A way of getting from place to place? Or a road for a wagon to use? Which one could we put in here and it would make sense? They did not use a train, so we know it's not train tracks. And it's not a tunnel. They didn't talk about going underground at all. That leaves you with C or D. You need to choose. Okay, so I've read to you pages 1 and 2. We've gone through the questions. Oh, and 3 for the timeline. We've read through some of the questions. If you still need help, make sure you log on at 12:30 for homework help. Thanks for watching.